10 years ago, the series, we now know as Like a Dragon, was in a drastically different state than we see today. The official localization of Yakuza 5 was still months away. The future of the franchise in the West was dire, to say the least, and yet, unbeknownst to all of us, a game that would change all of that for the better would soon release in Japan. In roughly 3 weeks' time, we will officially be celebrating the 10-year anniversary of Yakuza 0, the game towards which many attribute the resurrection of the franchise in the West, and an example of what a refined version of this bizarrely beautiful series could be. Much like with my previous video on Devil May Cry 3, the game we're discussing today also has a reputation that precedes it, except in the case of Yakuza 0, its reputation may have actually led to much more vocal criticism from hardcore fans by nature of how different the franchise's landscape would be post its release. We all know the game made a massive impact soon after its launch, so the question that remains is the game still an amazing gem, or are we perhaps letting our nostalgia frame it as one? Well, join me as we try to answer this conundrum through this brief presentation. We'll start off with a brief overview of the story, meaning that yes, there will be spoilers. First off, let's start with the premise of creating Zero as a prequel. The idea of telling a character's origins through a dedicated game can lead to drastically different results, from having an entry that cements said character as an eternal legend, like Metal Gear Solid 3 did, or alternatively, an entry that largely feels redundant in the grand scope of the series' narrative, like with The Phantom Pain. Now, leading into the release of Yakuza 0, this series was in a pretty strange spot, experimenting with various new characters and perpetually expanding the scope of its world and gameplay mechanics. The outcome of this experimentation also led to fairly divisive narratives, most notably with Yakuza 4 and 5, though the criticisms people had towards these games couldn't be further apart when you really looked into it. Whatever the case may have been, these games weren't the hits RGG may have wished them to be, nor the hits they deserved to be. So, with how Kiryu's fate after the end of Yakuza 5 was up to anyone's guess, going for a prequel setting is likely the boldest choice you can make. If you do it poorly, it might realistically be the nail in the coffin for that character. And yet, RGG also saw it fit to add Majima into the role of a co-lead to make things even more challenging. In the case of the Mad Dog especially, revealing too much of his thought patterns and personal history runs the risk of ruining the mystique that in part made him as beloved as he is, and Yokoyama-san himself already noted how writing said character was especially difficult for him. I really want to hammer home the risk behind this overall premise, because any mismatched creative choice beyond this point could have led Yakuza 0 into the direction of becoming another divisive narrative. However, between the narrative groundwork in the past mainline entries laid out, and the experimentation the writers went through in Yakuza 4 and 5, 0 really was the perfect opportunity to see how much they've learned and grown since 2005. No matter what you think of the stories in this series, it's evident that 0 is the result of every positive and negative committed by its predecessors. It maintained a sense of scale and magnitude without going overboard, as the story had the perfect structure between its two main characters. Switching the perspective every 2 chapters meant that you had just enough time to get accustomed to the section of the plot in one city without forgetting the developments of the other city's plot. And if you wound up going overboard with doing side activities in the meantime, the recap cinematics before the protagonist switch could fill in the gaps where needed. As for the arcs of the characters themselves though, we've seen a rather interesting switch in the way they were perceived, as a more recent argument against this game became how 0 doesn't technically tell the origins of Kiryu and Majima as Yakuza. It more so shows the spark that lit the fuse while they were already in the underworld, and then we cut to them fully being legends from the other main lines. While I understand this train of thought, to me, it felt like the focus of 0 was always intended to be the more human element within the paradigm of the criminal underworld in and of itself, rather than focusing on the thought pattern that would lead someone to join the underworld in the first place. Similarly, the individual acts that could reinforce the protagonists being legends after attaining their Dragon and Mad Dog titles would be less important than the motivation that led up to said acts, as we see the reinforcement of the aforementioned title's value all throughout the other mainline entries. So, what does this origin story do for its leading cast? We see Kiryu change from his inexperienced, even star-eyed perspective towards the lifestyle to attaining his confident and deliberate demeanor that is fully integrated in the underworld, simultaneously accepting the weight of being a notable Yakuza once his legacy has truly begun. Majima, on the other hand, learns to harness his anger and knowledge in a way he wishes to, rather than letting it consume him or end up playing the fool for someone else's enjoyment. This also means that him being perceived as being out of his mind beyond the events of Yakuza 0 would in turn be the result of him desiring to be seen in such a way for reasons unique to him. As for why they joined the Yakuza at all, while it wasn't the focal point of the story, Zero still gave us interesting answers to the question that were in line with the writing of the characters from Yakuza 1 to 5. Kiryu's motivation was shown to be rooted in him following Kazuma's footsteps as a result of idolizing him. Given that this is a very direct and concise character we're talking about, offering such a clear explanation for his backstory makes sense. With Majima, on the other hand, the fact we still don't know anything about his childhood and upbringing actually makes more sense than him outright stating it, because the mystery behind his behavior was, again, one of the pillars as to why he became so beloved in the community. We could never get a clear read on him. We frequently saw him as an entertaining element of chaos, and even the games that delved deeper into his past still left heaps of material hidden away, like how he met Saejima, got engaged to Park, or adjusted to living life after leaving the Hole and eventually becoming the beloved Lord of the Night. Characters like him have no need to tell you their story beat for beat, as the psychological scars noticed through interacting with them tell you well enough that it's a story not fondly remembered. And the same applies to Kiryu's and Majima's thoughts on being legends. The moment they attained their titles is when they noticed the bloodshed people perpetuated in pursuit of such legacies, rendering their lives as warning signs rather than something to idolize or further inquire about. Stepping away from our leading duo for a bit, the premise of Yakuza 0 already showing us people from the underworld in the 1980s actually allowed us to zero in on the more important dynamics that would shape Yakuza 1. Not even talking about Nishiki, who was turned into the gem many had hoped the original version to have been, in terms of the camaraderie with Kiryu, nearly everyone was given a massive upgrade. Kashiwagi is written amazingly. Sera actually feels like a threat during the fight at the Nikkyo Consortium. Reina reaffirms why she's that old reliable friend anyone would wish into existence if they had the chance. It felt like everyone that reappeared from the first game was here for a reason, rather than to merely tick a proverbial box. Hence why the minimum of screen time given to Kazama and the absence of someone like Yumi could still be excused. This series already had the issue of juggling too many balls at once in a game, and ending up with a messy plot as a result. So if the stories of some other characters weren't integral for Kiryu and Majima to step into the legend lifestyle, then it was better to leave those stories for another time. At least in terms of Yumi's involvement, Gaiden alone already did a brilliant job on that front, without feeling like something senselessly tacked on. So yeah, while there may be spots for improvement, knowing your boundaries was the way to go here. On that note, I'll refrain from gushing over the antagonists of this entry, as the Dojima lieutenants in particular were the embodiments of classic Yakuza bigwigs. It makes sense, given that their live-action catalog largely comprises of them playing various roles within the aforementioned archetypes, but the fact their performances give off this classic crime vibe even to Western audiences who are largely unfamiliar with their acting pedigree is a testament to the skill on display. They admittedly have a ton more acting range than is presented in Zero, particularly with the more humorous side of expression. But again, RGG knew which aspects of their repertoire would best serve the story, so we got villains with razor-sharp execution, and boss fights that cemented the red carpet treatment from the story. Point being, the Dojima lieutenants speak for themselves. Now, granted, I'm usually known for being very nitpicky when it comes to the stories of the series, and Yakuza 0 is no exception. As parts of it, like Makoto acting so rashly towards the end of the game, are essentially a means of course-correcting Majima to reach a desired narrative end goal much sooner than he would have otherwise. Also, there's the clear moment of leaving the audience wanting more, which was shown in the way Kiryu and Majima crossed paths in the final scene. There is always room for improvement. But frankly, out of any Yakuza game we have witnessed thus far, 0 is genuinely the closest that we've gotten to a nigh-perfect narrative, pacing-wise and characterization-wise. It felt like a classic crime drama in its own right that anyone could appreciate. But once it is observed within the context of the overarching series, its expansion on past seeds and the planting of new ones is what makes this game truly special, as it genuinely elevates the franchise at large. If you've created a prequel that works this well in both of the aforementioned regards, then you've clearly struck gold with your story, and RGG most certainly has done so with Yakuza 0. But enough about the story. What's the gameplay like in this entry? Well, to start off, we'll need to address how Zero's combat wound up having its uniquely designed fighting styles in the first place, as it's another case of learning from past experiments. While every game starting with Yakuza 0 wound up consistently introducing more and more playstyles for experimentation, the narrative side of the games released from then on would frequently be forced to incorporate more characters than it could handle. So the fact a game like Ishin instead returned to the prototypical multi-style per character approach from Kenzan was the best choice to make in the long run. Now, how does this relate to 0? Well, in the context of Kenzan and Ishin, RGG effectively had a clean slate in developing predominantly weapon-based styles that featured the depth of their classic beat-em-up movesets. But given how mainline Yakuza is usually synonymous with hand-to-hand combat, this meant 0 would need to evolve in a different direction. The nature of the 6 styles given to Kiryu and Majima by default was that they all felt like an expansion on one element of the core movesets we associated with a given character, meaning that conceptually combining them into one would make sense for how the characters would play in the subsequent mainlines. In Kiryu's case, we were given an all-round style that lacked Dragon of Dojima's finesse, a faster style that lacked DOD's power, and a powerful style that naturally lacked its speed. Similarly with Majima, he was given a hand-to-hand style that was lacking in crowd control compared to the classic Mad Dog moveset, but he was also given a style that expanded on Majima's affinity for hard-hitting attacks, as well as one whose agility and crowd control is easily the most absurd in the game, even at a base level. The thing is that by nature of how well they're all implemented, and more importantly, how they complement one another, this is arguably the most complete that a playable character's skill set felt, with effectively no artificial combat depth being present. The 3 default styles per character all make up for each other's shortcomings perfectly, meaning that adding the legend styles on top of them into the freely switchable roster would have been redundant, as you'd likely just stick to the legend styles for the novelty alone if that were the case, even when a different style would be a better fit for a given encounter. Now admittedly, certain styles are still more spam-friendly than others, and each individual moveset is so fleshed out to where you could beat the game by just using one of them, which could lead people to call Yakuza 0 too easy or say how the other styles are simply wasted. Having said that, personally, I'd say it actually gives every player the option to customize their experience. If you just want to spam Breaker or Beast to clear everyone, then go nuts. If you want to be flashy and challenge yourself instead, then you'll find 0 to be a combat playground that gives you the right amount of tools to be creative without feeling overwhelmed at any point. As for the legend style specifically, while Majima's is effectively another fun, easy mode to use, the fact that Kiryu's is so clunky and unrefined by comparison makes it feel as if it was deliberately given to you as a means of challenging your knowledge of fundamentals. Now, granted, this could very well just be me seeing it this way, but with how slow Dragon style is in first and second gear, and how you're still given a move specifically made to drain your heat, I'd often see myself switching to Dragon style if I've spent too much time on my clear file of this game and started feeling like the game wasn't pushing me enough. Essentially, committing to the Legend styles in this game felt like a conscious choice, though the outcome may have been different from what an average player would have imagined. So, you may have noticed how I've been gushing over this game's combat for quite a while now, but even still, there are two elements from the gameplay that I consider to have aged poorly in this game. Those being the gear system and the Legend style upgrade tree. Now, what's the issue with them? Well, with the former, I should start by saying that I still understand its inclusion on a conceptual level. My theory is that RGG wanted to add further incentive for players to maintain their heat and utilize it in a way that's not just blindly spamming heat actions all the time. In Yakuza 5, for example, they added tech like Dragon Spirit, Tiger Puppetry, etc., while Ishin added comparably R2-dependent techniques alongside lowering the general damage output for heat actions. You might think that lowering the damage of a given heat action through overuse would be enough to make for a balanced experience, but clearly it wasn't enough in the long run. So, keeping that in mind, do I think the gear system was the right way to finally balance it? Well, no. Certain styles are just awful on lower gears, most notably the likes of Dragon of Dojima. And while there are ways of generating heat quickly, like a last-second dodge in Rush style, or abusing the AI via Slinger and Breaker spam, or hell, just taking a bike in B style and going nuts, the disparity between the lowest gear level and the highest one is a bit too much for a truly refined experience. While I still adore this combat system more than any other in the series, if we observe its utility from the lowest to the highest levels of play, oddities like these are what prevent both camps from fully immersing themselves in the true totality of its combat system. As for the Legend-style upgrade trees that I mentioned earlier, it genuinely feels like a needless risk that could ruin your experience moving forward. Given that they function as no-holds-barred stat increases and give you no option to refund your money if you boost yourself too far, it means your current save file could perpetually prevent you from being challenged in combat unless you decide to equip yourself with items specifically designed to ramp up enemy aggression. And even then, the upgrade trees can go into triple-digit levels, so if you're feeling particularly silly one afternoon and instinctively saved, then you're out of luck for good. Thankfully, like with the gear system, Yakuza Kiwami rectified these missteps. And while Kiwami specifically isn't among my favorites, its combat system, in many ways, feels like what Yakuza 0's should have been. And if that were the case, we'd likely have the single strongest Yakuza combat system in this game. But hey, the team is still learning and improving as we speak, so we might see a comparable peak in the future, like we've seen with Lost Judgment's bold steps forward. While we're on the topic of gameplay segments that haven't aged that well, I'll just throw in the Makoto protection segments and the car chase scene on top of them. The former should have been a one-and-done deal, rather than giving us two stealth segments with Majima and that construction site escort mission with Kiryu. As for the car chase, well, I predominantly blame the Legend difficulty playthrough for permanently scarring me on that front. Now, do these gameplay choices mean that this game is actually overrated and an overall step back for the series? No, of course not, because you need to look at the totality of the experience before actually judging it. So, if that's the case, then why do so many people in the community suddenly feel the need to blame a game like Zero, or more recently Yakuza 7, as actually being mediocre games that fooled the public into adoration? Well, at least as far as the most vocal detractors are concerned, I'd wager a guess it's due to the amount of attention it's brought the series, rather than something inherent to the games themselves. You know the whole duality of someone wanting a niche interest to be more widely adored, but then being infuriated when it becomes too adored in the future? Well, that's honestly an expected reaction to have, in a way. Franchises like Yakuza have this way of completely entrancing its players, and creating an unshakable bond with them more often than not. So if you perceive someone's behavior as somewhat disrespectful to the series by comparison, you'll likely want to pin that blame on something. And what do you know? Yakuza 0 effectively served as the perfect scapegoat in that regard. You notice how people start only playing Yakuza 0 and not the entire series? Oh, well, that's Yakuza 0's fault. Majima is written as a quote-unquote silly man in Majima Everywhere and Pirate Yakuza? Oh yeah, again, Zero's fault. You can pick any myriad of changes that emerged from the series post Yakuza 0, and someone will likely find a way to tie it to this game, leading them to be more critical of even the things that Zero truly excels at. However, this isn't meant to hand-wave away the genuine issues with this game. I may be well on record as considering this entry as the best in the series, but even I have had my issues with a number of his choices for years. The point is to instead observe the criticism one directs at the game in the right context. We've reached a point where every new Yakuza game will be vocally heralded as the greatest game ever by one fan and the downfall of RGG by another one. But at the root of both of these sentiments is the pursuit of having the company you love keep surpassing itself creatively. The thing is that the community has grown and changed over the years, just as the series itself has done since 2005. So if we aim to keep the games and fanbase healthy for subsequent generations, we can't just shift blame at one writing choice, one team member leaving, or one game for not connecting with us as the others have. RGG is a team that genuinely listens to its fans, so the best that we can do is express ourselves in a meaningful way to try and help. In conclusion, Yakuza 0 was an incredibly important step for RGG, and a truly world-changing experience for the series at large. So I'd like to take this opportunity to wish it a very happy birthday. Ideally, this video would be over an hour in length and cover everything that this entry offers. But as we've already learned, when it comes to Yakuza, no amount of verbal praise could truly compare to experiencing the games for yourselves. So instead, do me a favor, if you haven't already, and boot up this game. See what it is about it that charmed so many, and bring the series to where it is today. Who knows, you might actually find yourself falling in love with it again after some time away. Either way, while this video was all over the place, this was my best attempt at heavily abridging the experience that is Yakuza 0 in a way that still did it justice. Feel free to share your own experiences with this entry in the comments, and keep enjoying the, as of now, officially released Pirate Yakuza in the meantime. So, until next time, take care of yourselves, and have a great day. Cheers!